Welcome back to Hobby Jogger Elite. I chased the sub 3-hour marathon for quite some time before I actually achieved it. I wasn't quite expecting or anticipating as big of a leap from my third marathon when I ran 3:06 to my fourth marathon about a month or two ago when I ran 2:53, and 13 minutes off a marathon personal best when you are already hovering around that 3-hour mark isn't unprecedented, but it's a much bigger gap in terms of progress than I had ever made previously. To go from 3:16 on my very first marathon to 3:09 on my second marathon and then 3:06 on my third marathon didn't demonstrate to me the capacity to make those massive leaps in progress. So I thought it would be interesting to sort of hypothesize and speak on why I think that I was able to make such an unprecedented leap in progress, at least compared to what my previous differences in marathon times were before my most recent one. And I think the reasoning is probably simpler than a lot of people make it out to be. I would say one big reason why I put a 13-minute dent in my marathon personal best as opposed to a 3-minute leap forward in progress or, a 6-minute one like I did previously was diversifying my race distances and paces I was training at. That's not to say that when I ran 3:15 and then 3:09 and then 3:06 that I wasn't training at a variety of paces, but I would say I wasn't really racing at a variety of paces between those different races. So I finally ran something other than a marathon or half marathon for the first time at the beginning of 2023, just weeks after my third marathon when I ran 3:06. Seeing what it was like to train for those shorter, sharper distances, that process required me to work out in a different way and approach my training in a different way and run different paces. And I don't think it's any secret that running faster during training can make what you are trying to race at feel easier and hopefully push it forward over time. So I think something that not only people in general, but I think myself, I'll definitely speak from my perspective, I don't want to make any blanket generalizations here, can get stuck in a lull in terms of progress or just like feeling stale when they race the same distance over and over again. And maybe I am a bit of a hypocrite right now because I'm jumping back into marathon training right after I just ran a marathon, but I'm approaching my training this time, as I did last time, in a different way than I did during those first 3 marathons when I just didn't feel like I was making a lot of progress, when I saw that a lot of other runners experienced the biggest leaps forward in terms of progress during those first races, which is typically how it goes. Being able to train at 5K race pace and faster over the course of the spring and the summer prior to getting into marathon training and race multiple 5K races really made my threshold efforts feel easier and advance forward and become faster. And that made what I thought was marathon effort or a potential target marathon pace become faster and feel easier and easier because I had been able to, by training my VO2 max on a pretty consistent basis over and over again, make those pushes in terms of progress with my fitness. Whereas if I would have just kept training at those same target sub 3-hour marathon paces over the course of the year, it may not have pushed me forward quite as much as it ended up doing. So I think it's really important to, even if you really like one race distance a lot, give the other ones a try. At least from my own experience, I'm not getting paid to run. I'm not running professionally or even semi-professionally or in an amateur sense. I'm purely a recreational runner. I'm doing this for fun. Why not try different race distances and see if it can help me with the distances that I have the most fun with, which is no doubt the marathon distance. So a second reason, beyond just running at different paces, racing at different distances, this may sound overly simplified and like I am trying to make it much more dumbed down than it really is, but I just generally ran more at a more consistent clip. So when I say that, I don't mean that I was pretty much running the same amount on a regular basis, but my marathon peak week was a couple miles longer than it had been in previous training blocks. No, I trained and ran more than I ever have during 2023 than I did in the lead up to previous years. I would always take a pretty substantial break and a pretty big step back in terms of volume and intensity in the quote unquote off season, if you even want to call it that for like a recreational runner, after my previous marathon. So I would take, a good week or so off of running, but beyond that, the longest run I would do prior to beginning marathon training again for months and months on end was maybe 12, 13, 14 miles if I was really feeling it. Whereas throughout all of 2023, before I even started marathon training for this most recent fall marathon, I was making sure that I was running 14 to 16 mile long runs every single weekend throughout the year. Now, if you're somebody who doesn't like to run a lot and doesn't like to run long, then that may not sound all that appealing to you. But the benefit of that was that by maintaining that big of like a normal maintenance long run, I was able to sustain a bit higher mileage throughout the year than I was in previous years and in previous off seasons. And then when I actually started marathon training again, I didn't have to take all this time to build up from a 10-mile long run to a 12-mile long run, and then 14, 15, 16, and finally after several weeks be in the regular routine of running those 17 to 22-mile long runs on every weekend for marathon training. Instead, I could just kind of jump up to the 18 to 20 mile long runs on a regular basis immediately from the beginning of the training block because I had maintained that regular routine of running 14 to 16 mile long runs all throughout the year. And on top of that, that just kind of bolstered my weekly mileage throughout the year. So instead of only running, let's say 30 to 40 miles in the off season, I was running 50 to 60 miles in the off season on a normal weekly basis when I wasn't actually doing any race specific training. And then when I jumped into marathon training, I was able to increase my mileage, still at a sort of safe rate, but increase it to a point where I was able to sustain higher weekly mileage amounts than I ever had before. And I put together my biggest training block in terms of not just intensity, but definitely in terms of quantity of miles than I ever had before. So I felt like stamina-wise and just general aerobic fitness wise, I was in a far better spot than I ever had been before. And there's no disappointment in me running a 3:06 previously, but I can definitely sense a massive, massive difference in the way that I entered my training block for my 3:06 marathon than I did for my 2:53 marathon training block. I was so much more ready to tackle those faster paces. Marathon pace, threshold pace, all felt incredibly comfortable at the beginning of the training block this time around because I had put in so much base mileage, had made the long run a regular part of my weekly routine. It was a staple of my normal off-season running, so that by the time marathon training came around, I was just used to it and ready. It didn't feel as intimidating and I could just kind of jump right into it. Obviously, you're not at your absolute peak mileage year round. You would probably increase your risk for injury doing that, but just making sure it's at a pretty decent level so that you don't have to make as massive of a leap to get into that more intense or regular marathon training than you did before. I would say a third reason why I was able to make this much progress from my third marathon to my fourth marathon was because of my sort of switch in training philosophy. I previously trained pretty much exclusively with Fitzinger's Advanced Marathoning in my first 3 marathons. I followed those plans pretty much to a T. And I wouldn't say that those are bad training plans. If you've read Fitzinger's Advanced Marathoning, if you've followed those training plans before, I've seen a ton of people have a lot of success and run some really fast times at the marathon distance following Fitzinger's Advanced Marathoning training plans. But training is not a one size fits all type of approach. Every training philosophy doesn't work for every single person, for every single runner. And I think this time around, being willing to sort of stray from what I had done previously when I hadn't necessarily reached my goal in those first 3 marathons and finally explored some new training philosophies really allowed me to unlock some different things when it came to my marathon training and racing. I transitioned from Fitzinger to Daniel's running formula, which I would say was a pretty big step forward in terms of regular weekly intensity. I specifically followed the 2 quality session plan for Daniel's running formula. And I remember kind of looking at that plan when I was following Fitzinger a couple years ago and even up to last year, and it just felt incredibly intimidating. And for some reason, I was scared, frankly, to follow Daniel's running formula. It seemed like a huge increase in terms of intensity. The workout seemed impossible. I didn't even want to try them. But I for whatever reason, decided to at least give it a try and approach it with a I have nothing to lose sort of mentality. And I can't be happier that I did that, because I think following that running plan and that sort of training philosophy as opposed to Fitzinger really propelled me forward when it came to those various training paces and my overall readiness for the marathon distance. That's not to say I wasn't ready to race at the marathon distance with Fitzinger, but I think changing up my training, and honestly, I felt like it simplified things as well. I feel like with Fitzinger, I was always looking for other workouts to do, because if you followed Fitzinger before, you know that the quality sessions aren't all that present, to be completely honest. They're pretty simple. You know, you have some long tempo runs, you have some marathon simulation workouts for your long runs, a couple tune-up races possibly, and that's about it. I need to sort of keep things fresh and interesting and get kind of creative with workouts when it comes to my training, especially if I'm training for 16, 17, 18 weeks for a marathon. Things can get pretty stale pretty quickly for me, especially for something I enjoy doing this much. I don't want to completely boil it down to like 2 types of workouts for that long. I want to keep things fresh and introduce some variety and enjoy it. And I felt like it was a lot of work to try to do that when it came to following Fitzinger's training plans, as opposed to Daniel's running formula, which is still repetitive to some extent, but has a lot more variety. And I think both mentally and physically suited me a lot better. So being willing to change my training approach from my first 3 marathons, and then finally, I change it to something else for my 4th marathon, and I see more progress than I ever have before. And the workouts were different. There was more variety. I wouldn't say they were necessarily more complicated, but some of them were more complicated. But I honestly found the overall plan and approach to be more simple once you figured out like your VDOT calculator, for instance, your VDOT value, and figured out what your, repetition pace is, what your interval pace is, what your threshold pace is, what your marathon pace is. Once you do that sort of legwork in the beginning and then jump into the plan and understand the overall philosophy, I found it much more simple, especially with 2 quality sessions. You're going to work out 2 times every single week. Every other day is sort of up to you what you do with those. You maintain a certain range of like 10 to 15 miles. I followed the 71 to 85 mile per week plan, and it was that simple. I found 2 days a week when I knew I had the time to put in some longer quality workouts. Every other day, just did some easy mileage, and that was that. So I think being willing to change up my approach, really focus and prioritize 2 workouts or 2 quality sessions every 7-day weekly cycle, and sort of leave it at that and sort of rinse and repeat, definitely gave me a much better result than I had anticipated, and obviously much better than I had ever done before. The 4th and final reason why I think I made more progress between my 3rd and 4th marathon than I did in between any other pair of races was figuring out all those supplemental things. People call them oftentimes the 1%ers. And if you figure out enough of the 1%ers with your running or anything in life, it adds up to much more than 1%, and it can really take a lot of time off your race time, for instance. Before I even began my training block, I sort of assessed what had gone wrong, whether that was my half marathon training earlier in 2023, whether that was previous marathon training blocks, or even some of the 5K training that I had done in 2023 as well. And I targeted some weaknesses when it came to not just running, not just training, but everything else that sort of supplements your running and training. My nutrition, for instance, I have never been somebody who is good with like moderation when it comes to food. When I am hungry, I am hungry. And when I want to eat, I eat a lot. And I realized that early on in 2023, I had not been giving my body what it needed in order to support that much running, that intense of running, that intense of training. I had just not been feeling well. I was not eating all that well. I was not eating enough of what I needed to be eating, and I was probably eating too much of everything I didn't need to be eating. So I didn't restrict my food intake or anything like that. If anything, I ate even more than I did before. I was just putting the right kind of fuel into my body and prioritizing more of a whole foods healthy diet. And I immediately saw results, not just in my general daily life, but especially so in my running. If you fuel well and fuel properly, your running is going to become so much better. And it wasn't just nutrition and my diet that needed some cleaning up. I did absolutely no cross training, no strength training, no core training, no conditioning, no mobility, no stretching, nothing. Previous to the spring of 2023, I was literally going for runs every morning, and I would do absolutely nothing the rest of the day on any day. I was just running, and that was it. And I realized that a lot of the small nagging injuries that would sort of ebb and flow throughout the year, throughout training blocks, were a result of weaknesses I had had by not strength training or doing any core work or anything at all. So I made it a priority to, at a minimum, once, twice, maybe 3 times, do some core, do some strength work every single week. I've posted my core routine on this channel. I also do a strength routine, which depending on the day might take me anywhere from 30 to 40 minutes. I do that maybe twice, maybe 3 times a week. And I have noticed those small nagging injuries not popping up anymore. And I have noticed that I run stronger. I have more power in my stride. It has transformed the way that I run and has made paces that seemed quite a bit harder in the past feel much easier because I am a stronger runner now. I am a healthier runner now. And those small injuries and small weaknesses have sort of been eliminated in some sense by just making it a priority to here and there for 15, 20, 30 minutes, strength train, work on mobility, work on core. And that is just another small 1% supplemental exercise that, again, with proper nutrition, with proper strength training and core training, mobility work, can add up more and more and more. I also took the time to not just eat better, but fuel properly both before and during runs. So I figured out which gels were working well for me and sitting well in my stomach, so I didn't have to worry about an absolute stomach blow up out on the run when I took them with me. And I figured out what kind of carbs to take before my run, how many carbs I needed to take. I figured out how I should carb load before a long run, and that I'm going to feel a lot better that morning when I'm out on the run based on what I ate the day before, and that I need to supplement all my nutrition afterward as well with a lot of protein and carbs and just really take care of my body. I think all of this wrapped up into one statement is I put the time and effort and thought into taking care of my body when it came to making it stronger, fueling it properly before and during runs, and making sure that my nutrition actually worked well with running and didn't stifle me in any way when it came to achieving what I was trying to achieve. And when you do all these small 1% things, maybe it's 1% cleaning up your diet, 1% figuring out the optimal fuel for you while you're running and training for a marathon, figuring out what strength routine, core routine, mobility looks like for you, figuring out what shoes work the best for you before you get started training. All of those 1% things can add up to 4, 5, 6%. And 4 or 5 or 6% of your marathon time is an absolute massive amount when it adds up. That is minutes upon minutes upon minutes. So in order to do all of that, yes, it takes being a bit more proactive, planning, doing a little bit of research, approaching your everyday life with a bit more intention and focus. But if you're taking all this time to train, you're training for months and weeks on end, and all you can think about while you are training is achieving that goal, all those things are going to be worth it in the end. I can promise you that it felt a lot better to achieve my goal and blow it out of the water when I ran 2:53 in November than it did in previous years when I was not achieving anything close into what I wanted to do. Those are what I believe may be the reasons that I took that kind of step forward in the marathon, running 3 hours and 6 minutes in November of 2022, coming back in November of 2023 and running 2 hours and 53 minutes. I'm going to continue to apply all these principles, all those little 1% things, make sure I continue to do strength training, core training, mobility, continue to eat as well as I possibly can, as hard as that can be during the holidays. I'm going to try my absolute best with that. I'm going to continue to try to maintain a bit of a higher maintenance mileage, continue to prioritize marathon specific elements like long run, continue to try to diversify my training paces, my race distances throughout the year. And hopefully that will continue to yield some positive results when it comes to making progress at the marathon distance. So, any of the reasons that I talked about today, do you agree with them? Do you disagree with them? Do you have some of your own steps, some of your own processes and practices that have helped you out along the way? Let me know down in the comments what you think, what you have done, or what you think of some of the tips that I mentioned that have worked for me over the past year or so. Other than that, we will catch up soon. Peace.